Today we're looking at Unit 5, Notes number 2, War in Europe. So we'll be looking at how the war in Europe actually begins. Austria and Czechoslovakia fall. Hitler's plan was to absorb Austria and Czechoslovakia into the Third Reich in order to allow Germany to grow and prosper. So those were the first two countries he wanted to invade. He wanted to make part of Germany's new Third Reich. Austria was Hitler's first target. The majority of the Austrians, 6 million people, were German, who favored this unification with Germany. On March 12th, 1938, German troops marched into Austria unopposed. Like I said, the majority of the Austrian people wanted this unification. And so, even though it was an invasion, it was a takeover, there was no fighting. So a day later, Germany announces that the Anschluss, or union with Austria, was complete. Hitler then turned to Czechoslovakia. About 3 million Germans lived in the western region known as the Sudetenland, and he wanted to annex this portion, just that portion, to provide more living space to his German people. However, he's basically asking another country to give up their land, which they do not want to do. So if Czechoslovakia refuses, Hitler will invade and there will be a conflict. And people do not want to see that happen. The Sudetenland. Hitler began to position troops at the Czech border. England and France promised to protect Czechoslovakia. So seeing that potential conflict was going to happen, Hitler invited the French premier and the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain to meet with him in Munich to discuss this conflict and how it can be solved. Hitler declared that this would be his last territorial demand. If you give me the Sudetenland, all I want is that western region of Czechoslovakia to bring in the primarily German-speaking people into the Third Reich. And then both the representatives from England and France were eager to avoid war. So this is not even 20 years after the end of World War One. No one wants to see another war happen. So if they could solve this crisis without going to war, they will do it. Appeasement in action. On September 30th, 1938, the Munich Agreement was signed, which turned the Sudetenland over to Germany without a single shot being fired. So Neville Chamberlain went back to England. He believed that he had avoided war. We have peace. Everything is fine. But Winston Churchill was a political rival of his and criticized the Munich Agreement for adopting a policy of appeasement, which means to give up on principles to pacify an aggressor. So let's stop and think. Why is appeasement not a good policy when dealing with an aggressor like Hitler? So by utilizing this appeasement policy, yes, Chamberlain and the French premier did not want to go to war, but all they're doing is just giving Hitler what he wants so that he does not attack. They aren't really solving the problem, they aren't really solving the issue at hand. And the only thing it really does for an aggressor like Hitler is show that no one's willing to stand up to his bullying and his demands. The Soviet Union declares neutrality. In the spring of 1939, Hitler began to set his sights on Poland. However, an attack on Poland might bring Germany into conflict with the Soviet Union because Poland shares a border with the Soviet Union. They could potentially think that Germany would want to go past Poland and invade the Soviet Union. And it would also bring a declaration of war from France and Britain. So this could potentially mean for Germany to be fighting a two-front war, the Soviet Union on the east, France and Britain on the west, and he did not want that to happen. So he proposed a non-aggression pact with Stalin, and Stalin surprised everyone by agreeing to sign it on August 23rd, 1939. So with this non-aggression pact, both sides are committed to not attack one another. They also signed a second pact agreeing to divide Poland between the two of them. And so all Stalin has to do is agree to stay out of the war, stay neutral, and he will give half of Poland to the Soviet Union. So now there's nothing left to stand in the way of Germany's invasion of Poland. So let's think a little bit more about this non aggression pact. So remember, this does not make Hitler and Stalin allies. They are not working together. They're just agreeing to stay out of each other's way. And as you can see with this political cartoon, they don't really trust each other. So they have this agreement, which they're kind of tied together, but they both have their guns. They're putting their best face forward. But again, they do not trust each other. And then, spoiler alert, this non aggression pact does not last very long because Hitler goes back on his word and he does eventually invade the Soviet Union. But again, they're not allies, they're just agreeing not to attack one another. So let's stop and think, what is the goal of this non aggression pact? So for Hitler, it's a way for him to be able to invade Poland. He does not want to have to deal with the Soviet Union yet at this moment. So he's kind of, creating this whole elaborate charade that they're going to stay out of each other's way, that he's good on his promises. But we know that's not necessarily true. Um, and then for Stalin, he's thinking it's a great deal. He doesn't have to go fight a war. He's going to get part of Poland. So at the time, it seems like a good deal for both sides. Blitzkrieg in Poland. On September 1st, 1939, the German Air Force roared over Poland, dropping bombs. At the same time, German tanks raced across the Polish countryside. This invasion was the first test of Germany's newest military technology, the Blitzkrieg. And so, this fighting style was something new. Countries, it made it very difficult for them to adopt a defense against it because it happened so fast. It was known as lightning war because you have the bombs, everyone's disoriented, then tanks are coming through, then you have the infantry marching through, that it just happened so fast and so quickly. So on September 3rd, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Blitzkrieg tactics were working perfectly um, for the Nazis, doing everything they wanted it to accomplish. And the major fighting was over in a matter of 3 weeks, so the Allies could not even mount a proper defense. And so World War II in Europe had officially begun with this attack in Poland. So Blitzkrieg in action. So again, it's a three-prong attack. We have the Air Force going in first, dropping bombs. Then you have the tanks and artillery next. And then lastly, you have your infantry following up. And so this, again, made it very difficult for countries to defend against. This is basically the reason why we see a lot of victories for Germany happening very quickly. He's able to attack and overwhelm so many countries very quickly initially. The phony war. For the next several months after the fall of Poland, French and British troops waited at the French border for Germany to make their next move. They had expected them to continue invading, moving further. And so this came to be known as the phony war because after the invasion of Poland, Germany didn't really go anywhere. Nothing else was happening. Suddenly, on April 9th, 1940, Hitler launched a surprise invasion on Denmark and Norway. Hitler planned to build bases along the coast to strike Great Britain. Hitler next turned against the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. They were taken over by the end of May 1940, so that phony war was over. He was making his next moves. The fall of France. Within a few months, France was ready to surrender. On June 22nd, 1940, it was agreed that the Germans would occupy the northern part of France and a Nazi controlled puppet government would be set up in Vichy in southern France. So, in just a matter of 6 weeks, the country of France had fallen and were forced to surrender to Germany. After the French fell, a French general named Charles de Gaulle fled to England, where he set up a government in exile. So, he's working with the English. They are trying to come up with the plan, come up with an attack. How are we going to fight against Hitler? How are we going to get him? How are we going to defeat him? The Battle of Britain. In the summer of 1940, Germany began to make bombing runs over Great Britain. Every night for 2 solid months, bombers pounded London. And so the citizens of London would have to hide in basements. Many of them hid in their tubes, tunnels, tube stations to protect themselves from the bombing raids. The Royal Air Force, the RAF, fought back using radar, which is a brand new technology. They were able to pinpoint where the German planes were. And so on September 15th, 1940, the RAF shot down 185 German planes. And as a result, Hitler had called off the invasion of Britain. They still had bombing raids to try to destroy supply lines and target specific areas, but the regular bombings every night stopped, whereas more periodic, so that way they didn't know when it would be coming. Okay, so here's a map of Europe, and this is actually a little bit further into 1941 than where we're leaving off, but just to give you an idea of this, how much damage Germany was doing. So we see Germany's in the more of a gold mustard color with Italy because they are the Axis powers. They are working together. And so Germany had begun by invading Austria, Czechoslovakia, then Poland. He will backstab Stalin and eventually go into the Soviet Union later in 1940, 1941. He moved to the west. He's in France. He began bombing raids in Great Britain. So pretty much he's taking over Western Europe. There are a few countries that at this moment are still neutral. Italy had taken over parts of Northern Africa. So just this whole Axis power Nazi invasion is spreading like wildfire. And so this is kind of where we're going to leave it at the moment. And so let's stop and think. How do you think America will respond to the swift attacks and the success of the Nazis? Next time, we will look at what the response is from the US. What is their reaction? How are they mobilizing? What are they doing? Are they going to send troops right away? Because across the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, I mean, when you're hearing about all this, are you thinking, will Hitler stop? Does he have intentions to move to America? So all of these things are being thought of by the Americans at this time. So these are the end of the notes. Make sure you go back, do your key terms, and begin reviewing your questions.